So, hello, welcome everybody. This morning we've got Ela Curic talking to us, who wrote an essay for the Rare Voice competition, all about the Diagnostic Odyssey. So I'm going to hand over to Ela. Okay,
hello.
Ela.
So as Adam said, last year I wrote an essay it was a UK charity called Beacon for Rare Diseases, and the essay question was about the Diagnostic Odyssey, and as part of the essay I interviewed Adam. So I'll be talking a bit about that today and what I found out in writing the essay. In terms of my interest in rare diseases, I'm a fifth-year medical student in Sydney, and last year I did a lot of my honours research in rare disease diagnostics. So I did a literature review about undiagnosed disease programs around the world, which is kind of a new approach to a way of diagnosing individuals with rare genetic conditions. And then I did my actual honours about whole genome sequencing specifically, and the utility of reanalysis in diagnosing rare diseases. But today I'll be talking about the essay that I wrote, for which the question was, diagnosis can be a challenging journey for many people living with a rare condition. Compare and contrast the diagnostic journey of two or more people or families living with a rare condition, reflecting on the impact of these experiences on their mental well-being. So as a bit of background, rare diseases individually affect less than 5 in 10,000 individuals by definition, but cumulatively, with the amount of rare diseases, this is around 1 in 16 people, or around 300 million people around the world. A lot of rare conditions have a genetic basis, and so a diagnosis is a very important part of actually being able to support and manage these individuals, as well as in things like reproductive counselling and looking at potential therapies. But a lot of people with rare genetic diseases don't get a diagnosis after routine clinical genetics care. And there's a term called a diagnostic odyssey, which they sometimes use to describe this process because it can be so difficult to go through a series of consultations and investigations and genetic testing. And what I looked at in this essay was what kind of impact this process can have on someone's mental well-being. So I interviewed 2 people with rare diseases for this essay. I spoke to Adam, who many of you know, and he's the chair of the HSP UK support group. And for him, he talked about how there was always this question of diagnosis, even prior to any symptoms. And this largely framed his diagnostic journey. So he said his mother, his grandmother, and his maternal uncle all had HSP, which, as I'm sure many of you are aware, is a group of rare genetic disorders that affects the upper motor neurons and manifests as generally a progressive spasticity and paraplegia, and affects less than 5 in 100,000 individuals, so 3.6 individuals. Then I also spoke to Laura, who had a very different diagnostic journey, and she was diagnosed with Bethlem myopathy with no family history of this condition, but it's similarly a rare genetic change. So she was 4 or 5 when her parents first noticed that she was walking on her tiptoes and that she was weaker than many other children her age. And she went and saw a series of primary care specialists and a series of more specific specialists, and that revealed nothing. So it wasn't until she was 12, so a good 8 years after the symptoms were first picked up, that a research group in the US actually did genetic testing, and she was diagnosed with Bethlem myopathy. Bethlem myopathy is also a condition that affects the motor system, and it's a muscular dystrophy, which is characterized by proximal muscle weakness and joint contractures, and the prevalence is 0.77 per 100,000 people. So in terms of looking at this diagnostic journey, or diagnostic odyssey, as it's sometimes called, the time to diagnosis of a rare disease is often over 5 years. So part of this is because traditional diagnostic paradigms are based on principles of recognizing signs and symptoms which are common, which by definition is unsuitable for rare conditions which are affecting fewer than 5 in 100,000 people. So people might be subject to a disjointed series of consultations and investigations and genetic studies, And today I'll talk about the implications of this diagnosis or lack of diagnosis on mental well-being, and 3 specific points here. So firstly, how this might change how people navigate the health system and the world around them, the uncertainty in this process of diagnosis, and the importance of connection. Firstly, in terms of thinking about navigating a health system with a rare condition, there's often no clear route to diagnosis. So a patient with a rare condition in the UK or US is reported to visit 8 clinicians. So that's often around 4 primary care doctors and 4 specialist doctors, and be misdiagnosed 2 or 3 times before they finally receive a diagnosis. So this obviously can be hugely challenging for mental well-being, and the burden of navigating the health system is often placed entirely on an individual, and they're expected to understand where to go next. Then there's also the fact that in a broader sense, if you've got a rare condition, particularly one that affects mobility, it can be very challenging to navigate a world which isn't necessarily well suited to your needs. And this was something that both Adam and Laura really talked about, and how far-reaching the implications of mental well-being can be in this sense. Diagnosis can be quite important here, and Adam talked about how he found the fact that he could know that the exercises and stretches he was doing were helpful could mean they had a more positive effect on his mental health. And that was something that came in part with the diagnosis. For Laura, in a more practical sense, she talked about how a formal diagnosis meant she had access to countless benefits. And in Australia, there's something called the National Disability Insurance Scheme, which kind of guards a lot of the services that might be available to you if you've got certain diagnoses. And so when she actually got this official diagnosis, she could get access to things like a mobility pass and physiotherapy and occupational therapy. And it made it much easier to navigate the world around her with this diagnosis as opposed to without one. The next thing I'll talk about is the fact that there's a lot of uncertainty throughout this process. So not only about diagnosis, but also obviously about prognosis and treatment. And this can have a huge impact on mental well-being. For Laura, she talked about the right to know what was coming and how important it was for her that even though she had a progressive condition without known treatment, the diagnosis could show her what her future might look like. And it reframed a lot of the symptoms that she'd had all separately. And she talked about looking at these symptoms and feeling quite comforted by the fact that they described her. It can also have implications more broadly, and a sense of certainty might help with reproductive implications. And so Adam spoke about how he looked for genetic testing when his wife felt pregnant. So knowing that if he had HSP, the child would have a 50% chance of inheriting the condition. But also the implications of resolving this for himself, because as he began to notice these symptoms, he could look to his mother as foresight of what might be coming and have a sense of certainty that came with this diagnosis. I think even though this can obviously be beneficial in terms of mental well-being, I think it's important to think about the fact that there's a lower health-related quality of life in adults with rare conditions than those with chronic conditions. And a part of that is the fact that uncertainty obviously isn't resolved with a diagnosis. So even though there might be more clarity about what exactly is going on, by nature, rare conditions aren't necessarily well known about, and the prognosis and treatment can still be something that's very uncertain for the individual. And finally, I looked at how an individual can feel really disconnected through the diagnostic process, and how rare diseases in themselves can be very isolating. So this was something that was very variable and very different between Laura and Adam. As Laura, even though she's got her formal diagnosis of a rare disease and her condition, she's never met anyone else with Bethlem myopathy. She wasn't part of a support group at all, and there isn't actually a support group for Bethlem myopathy in Australia. But I think nonetheless, for some people, diagnoses can offer hugely important avenues for connection. And Adam talked a lot about how contact with other people with HSP has been a hugely important part of his life since his diagnosis, and where there can be difficulties in the other two things I talked about in terms of navigation and uncertainty, even after diagnosis, connection is something that a diagnosis can often offer. And support groups do actually exist for people without a formal diagnosis as well, particularly since this diagnostic journey can be so long and so isolating. But it can be sometimes hard to connect with others in different positions and with different conditions going through different health systems. But I do think something I found out in both my research and in writing this essay is that formal psychological support or support avenues for people going through the diagnostic process and being diagnosed with a rare disease is something hugely beneficial to mental well-being. So finally, the question was really, what does a diagnosis mean? And I think the answer is that the role of a diagnosis isn't always clear. And it can be very variable between individuals. And if you impose one specific meaning of a diagnosis on everyone with a rare condition, rare conditions can be so different that this can erase a lot of the understanding of the mental and emotional impact a diagnosis might have on an individual. But there were definitely important benefits in terms of mental well-being. Laura talked about how she could prepare for the unknown in a much clearer way, and she could access a lot more support with a diagnosis, even if the condition was still an uncertain one. And Adam talked about how rather than asking, what have I got, he could start asking, what does that mean? And that it's important to note here that although in many common conditions, treatment options might come with a diagnosis, this unfortunately isn't necessarily the case with rare diseases. But the diagnosis can still be an important first step in this direction. So although the mental well-being burden of the diagnostic process can be huge, I think the key point was one that Adam made clear in terms of how a diagnosis can offer you a connection to other people. He and Jackie as well talked about how this can be really helpful for well-being. And I think in looking at the diagnostic process for rare diseases and what can be improved, I think connection is a hugely important thing to strive for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ella. That's absolutely brilliant.